Hello and welcome to Conquering Chaos and Mayhem. I'm your moderator, Brett Glover, and it is my pleasure to introduce the host of Conquering Chaos and Mayhem, Daryl Cully. Daryl, how have you been?
Awesome. How are you, Brett?
Well, I got a little bigger over the holidays, I'm afraid to say, but I think I'm doing pretty okay otherwise. We got a really interesting guest lined up today, Daryl. She is an Indigenous mental health and wellness worker with experience in nonviolent crisis intervention, mediation, and diversion in Indigenous restorative justice. Please join me in welcoming Tara Hahkala. Tara, thanks for joining us today. This promises to be a very interesting conversation. I can't wait to see where it goes. Daryl, the floor is yours.
Well, welcome, Tara. We certainly appreciate you being able to join our podcast today. And your background is so wide, so varied, and you've got so much expertise. We really needed to narrow down our topic for today.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride, right? It's been, 20 plus years working with humans in a lot of different capacities. So I can't say there's an expertise, but there's certainly a breadth. And I hope we can, have a good conversation today.
One of the things that we had discussed as wanting to talk about today is the evacuations of First Nations, Indigenous communities during crisis. My background, of course, with air ambulance and the Ministry of Health was evacuating community hospitals and healthcare centers and the elderly from many of these communities during flooding. And more so, EMG has worked with some communities, First Nations communities, in their evacuations. But when the government comes in and says, everybody get out, there's a lot of things that need to be considered for the community. And I think there's often a misunderstanding by the government, or sometimes by those people who are taking on the evacuation, that, they can just say, get up and move, and everyone will do that. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of considerations that have to be given to the community. Can you touch on some of those?
Yeah. Where do you start, right? Some people are fine to move, but then there are your elderly and people who have, struggles with bodily movement, or who confined to a chair, or people who just really don't want to come to a larger center like Thunder Bay for whatever reason. So when I was working with Pikangikum for fire evacuations, there was a portion of people who could come, and a portion of people who didn't want to come, and then some who could come, but that even to get like the logistics of moving such a large amount of people, just the airplanes, hotel rooms, having enough food, having access to enough water, just the logistics are mind-boggling to move an entire community, right?
Well, one of the communities we worked with were rather concerned because they were going to be dispersed amongst hotels and motels across a city, very large city. But they wanted to maintain, council wanted to maintain their ability to connect with everybody, their ability to communicate, and still have council play a role. And so that, when the evacuation was ordered, the government really never gave them any consideration for that. So we tried to help them put together a central spot where council was available for the people to come in and meet with, and health services and social services from their own First Nation. As opposed to all of a sudden, here you are somewhere in a big city.
Right. Yeah. And what we saw with Pikangikum was there were, 3 different hotels that had space. So they were focused on those hotels, but they were spread out throughout the city. And then you had family members wanting to visit, but not being able to necessarily navigate, the bus routes or understand the distance, or that central meeting point would be great if it was available, right? But it's an emergency situation, so there's not always space. And there are other people coming into a larger center. So it's a tough one to navigate for sure.
And as you had mentioned, they're coming from a very small community where they
Mhm.
know everybody knows each other, to a place where there's a lot of strangers. And they're getting over that must be a real challenge.
There were definite stressors, especially for youth. I mean, youth and community could have a lot more freedom to move around and go places, right? But in a larger center like Thunder Bay, they become really vulnerable to certain segments of the population, vulnerable to assault, vulnerable to a lot of the worst things, right? That they don't see in northern communities. So used to the freedom to move and go where they want to go. But if you do that here and you don't know what areas are safe, that presented a lot of really concerning challenges. And that led to a lot of working with, police and emergency personnel. It led to potential, missing teenagers or needing to track people down. And a lot of worried parents saying, I could, back home, I would know where my child would be. There'd be here, or there, right? But here, you just take a long walk down Arthur Street or Red River Road, and they could be anywhere. And that's not like, and the stress of moving to you can just wander. If you're somewhere that's rural, you can just go for a walk, and it is generally safe. But if you're coming into a larger city, that sense of safety, even if you have it with you, it might not actually be as, safe.
So we bring in people who are used to being in a very small community where they know everybody. You walk down the street and everyone you see, to arriving in a large city where there's so many strangers, everybody's a stranger. And all of a sudden you've got the hustle and bustle of a city. You've got temptations that kids wouldn't normally have in their own communities. How do you prepare a community for that? And do we leave it till the time of evacuation, or should we be preparing communities in advance for, if this happens, this is what you might experience and how to deal with it?
I'm always going to argue in advanced preparation for everything, right? The more you know, the more power you have to control potential outcomes and avoid crisis situations. Is that a tough conversation to have and a tough conversation to, present? Yes, but knowledge is power, ultimately. Some of the situations that we saw could maybe have been avoided with a little bit of advanced knowledge, but you also don't know when a crisis like a fire or a flood is going to happen. So how do you prepare for the unknown? I suspect you could come in and present ahead of time. Like, these are the obstacles. If you get evacuated, if you head to, say, Thunder Bay and it's a larger center, here are some of the things that are actually happening in Thunder Bay, and not to be worried about it, but like, here are the things to be aware of, to be alert for, to be cautious of, right? Because you don't want to add fear to the situation, because then, we're already stressed out and worrying, but, here are some precautions you can take. And I like the idea of a central gathering place where they can meet with council. I think that's really nice. For a lot of the First Nations that were evacuated, they had crisis teams and security, and then people from community who they could touch base with, right? All in one center at each of the hotels. But it would be ideal if you could just take a community and put them in a space where they could be around their community instead of dispersed throughout the city. And able to, if there's, and the other thing we saw was really stressed out community members, right? Some people didn't speak English, and had not been out of their community before. So just, and I mean, you're used to familiar faces. You're used to being able to move around in comfort and confidence. And that definitely was a challenge here.
And as you said, you don't know when that's going to occur. But we do know that there's an increasing trend for larger wildfires, more wildfires. In the spring, we're talking about flooding and, evacuating First Nations on the coast of James Bay and that type of thing. So we do know that it may not be your community this year, it may be somebody else's, but if chief and council can work with planners and putting together a plan, so that they're not doing it at the last minute. They know where chief and council will go, and the elders of the community may be a great resource. And so, as you said, keeping them together in close proximity so that they can communicate and reassure and
be comfort for each other, right? 'Cause the familiar, when you're in, being around familiar phases, when you're in an unfamiliar place, having that circle of support around you, that really is a protective factor for how you're going to react in crisis, right? For de-stressing, okay, I can go visit, my extended family member. We can get together in a room and we can, talk and tell stories and watch our kids together and just share a meal or, whatever brings comfort, because those times of crisis, like the level of stress that people experience being displaced from your home and not knowing if you're even going to have a home to go back to. What's that like for a person, for a family, So anything that would provide comfort and stability and structure and support, that central meeting point. Even if the hotels that we saw, because there were 3, but they were literally all across the city, if there was a nice grouping, that physical proximity would make a really big difference, I think, for people in crisis.
Obviously the economics or whatever at the time, hotels have pre-bookings and that sort of thing. So it makes it very difficult to say, oh, we're all going to stay at one particular place.
Yeah.
But there may be options such as putting a regular shuttle that just drives between the three locations on an hourly or every 2 or 3 hours might help.
Yeah, a few times a day. Yeah. Or, around here, I don't know, but we have community centers where you could be, potentially booking, well, this is when we're all going to get together, right? And then shuttle people to that point. We saw just families separated, and that's never a great thing.
No. And you mentioned a great point, having a location where you can continue the traditions, celebrating someone's birthday or celebrating people, but continuing those instead of all of a sudden all of that's cut off for a period of time.
Yeah. Cultural ceremony is a really stabilizing factor for Indigenous people, right? That ability to meet and to, practice their traditional ways, which were taken for so long. That's a source of comfort and a protective factor too. So having a place where people can meet and smudge would make such a big difference.
Right. And you represent some of that within Thunder Bay, and you and your organization.
The organization that I work for, we do our best to provide cultural supports to reinforce cultural practices, traditional practices. And then we have a couple of really lovely workers who arrange things like sweat lodges and drumming groups and full moon ceremonies. And those are all really grounding practices. They're also a great place to release stress or any worry. And so, our agency, while we're, there's always restrictions and funding what a person can do on a 35-hour work week, but we do our best to work with Indigenous people in Thunder Bay, anyone who comes to Thunder Bay, anyone who comes through our doors, right? And we see, a full spectrum of humanity coming through the doors. For myself, even though I'm a third generation settler here, I've been working with traditional Indigenous cultural practices for about 3 years, and I find them really valuable in my personal life and in my professional life. And so to be able to smudge as in order to kind of ground yourself in chaos, right? Because again, we see, people coming from our tent cities coming through our doors, and people coming in acute stages of crisis, or people who come just because they want to talk about some of the grief and loss and trauma they've experienced. To be able to have a place to ground, and then the sweat lodge to release some of that stress, drumming circles to, bond with community, full moon ceremonies for women to, again, release some of the stress that comes with the intergenerational impacts of things like residential schools. And then, I mean, every community is experiencing a stress related to the history of what's happened. So the Friendship Center, as much as we can, when people come to Thunder Bay, we try and provide that kind of cultural center, that grounding point. Would I argue for better funding for all social service agencies that do this kind of work? Absolutely, because that would allow us to increase our ability to support people. But, we do what we can with what we have. And I think we do, a pretty good job. We get pretty good feedback, and we get some, sometimes we're able to transform some of the tears into smiles under different timelines for everybody, right? But that's pretty nice.
And such an important role, not only on a day-to-day basis, but especially in time of crisis, in time of evacuations. And so I really appreciate your input today. I'm sure we could go on for another hour without...
Probably a year, honestly. Just so many things. Yeah, for sure.
So we'll have to come back and do another podcast and continue the conversation. But let me just say to all the CEMCs out there, the Community Emergency Management Coordinators that are out there that are playing a role in these evacuations, that connecting with your local Indigenous Friendship Center, I don't think is optional. I think it's mandatory, and they need to get out and do it now, not when the crisis occurs, and make sure that you're part of that planning and support process right from day one, and
or even pre-day one, right? Like being proactive could really help alleviate stress when the crisis happens. And we know, crises are going to escalate. The climates are changing. So,
yeah, absolutely. So, thank you. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of interested listeners, and we'll get back together sometime soon.
And I'd like to echo Daryl's gratitude. Tara, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your insights. And on behalf of Daryl Cully, I'm Brett Glover. Thank you for listening to Conquering Chaos and Mayhem.